failed to heed your advice. Now, he does give Hugh advice about how to mitigate his superior's mismanagement. Well, he gives him advice in the sense that he encourages him to do it. He doesn't give him any advice about how to go about doing it. And he really seems to regard the whole thing as hopeless. So Hugh just needs to find a way consistent with his vows to get out from under his superior's authority. If he can't manage to do that, he needs to keep silent and do as he is told. Now, I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it shows us the sort of passivity that Anselm's view can very easily encourage. But two, because Anselm would shortly get a taste of his own medicine, as it were. Anselm later finds himself in a somewhat similar position, entrusted with an administrative responsibility that he found both unpleasant and fraught with moral ambiguities as Archbishop of Canterbury, working with two quite difficult Norman kings. Much as he had advised Hugh to do, Anselm addressed his pope, his superior, Urban II, in a letter that can easily be read as an attempt to induce Urban to relieve him of his bishopric. He couldn't take it upon himself to resign, because that would be an act of disobedience. But if he could persuade the Pope to fire him, he would be morally in the clear. So the reasoning is never, God has put me in this position. He must have some idea of what he wants me to do. Let me figure out what that is. It's, these Norman kings are driving me crazy. Get me out of this. But if I can't be got out of it, I'll tough it out because that's what I have to do. So the shortcoming on the side of those who are under authority is a kind of passivity that's encouraged. The shortcoming on the side of those who are in authority is a kind of inflexibility. I love this image. I don't know if you can quite make it out. This I call my angry bishop slide. The bishop not only looks quite angry, but the guys on the right look quite scared of him. And this seems to me quite appropriate for Anselm in his angry bishop phase, which was of long duration and considerable intensity. Because when your view is that earthly authorities are instituted by God, and it's the duty of those who are under an authority to obey, and then you find yourself in authority, well, dadgummit, people better obey. And you don't have to be particularly subtle or savvy about how you give them their orders, because they are, after all, orders that ought to be fulfilled. And Anselm, unfortunately, was not like that. Pastoral sensitivity sometimes, or political savvy, would have counseled a more temperate approach. Now, Anselm did have a lot of pastoral sensitivity. He had no political savvy. And we find this in many cases. I'll pick my favorite. Sandra, I think, finds it a little bit bizarre that I find this case so intriguing. But since I'm giving the lecture, I get to give it. This was near the end of Anselm's life. In May of 1108, the king's chaplain, Thomas, was named Archbishop of York. And the Archbishop-elect, delayed his profession of obedience to Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping, I think, in part that Anselm would die because he was old and he was ill, and he really thought if he just kind of postponed it, he could get out from under this. Well, Anselm just starts launching the nastiest letters. I mean, the chapter of York complains about how severely worded these letters are. He writes to the Pope. He writes to the King. It's just this one-man campaign, the likes of which we don't see again until the unfortunate Bernard versus Abelard letter-writing campaign of a while later. He even writes to Samson, the Bishop of Worcester, who happens to be Thomas's father, asking Bishop Samson, a friend of his, to suppress this disorderly, notice that word, this disorderly presumption. And Samson writes back to him, and I love the letter. Look, you're in the right. He should make his profession of obedience. Nonetheless, it is unworthy of you to be so angry over this affair. And what's interesting about this is that after the receipt of this letter, within a week, 2 weeks, he's at it again, and ramping it up and threatening people with excommunication. And he actually gets his way posthumously, in part because the king is afraid of incurring Anselm's excommunication. There's a further set of problems around marriage. What ought we to do? Well, on the one hand, his teaching is very concessive. This from Cordias Homo, Book 2 in Chapter 18. Although virginity is better than marriage, neither is determinately required of human beings. Rather, both someone who makes use of marriage and someone who prefers to remain a virgin are said to do what they ought to do. So if rectitude consists in doing what we ought to do, and rectitude of will preserved for its own sake is what justice is, then it would seem that the person who knows that God allows us to get married, and then in fact does get married, knowing that this is within God's will, that person would seem to be just, right? Great. I mean, virginity's better, and you get extra points for it, and he's very explicit about that. But still, marriage is licit, and a just person can be married. Very nice. Notice, by the way, now we have a happy bishop, because this is the happy bishop section, and we've got him blessing a wedding. At least I take it that's what he's doing. I mean, I see the word marriage right above it, so there we are. So that sounds really nice. Until you see what Anselm really thinks about what we ought to do. I mean, it's true that God left us free to marry if we want. But the chances of married people getting to heaven, very slim. And the desire to get married can only be because you value the things of the flesh in a way that is utterly, utterly inappropriate. I mean, it's a general rule in Anselm that pretty much the only way to heaven is to be a monk. Now, it is if you're married and you know, eventually sort of near the end of your life you take monastic vows, you can probably slip under the wire. But if you actually like marriage, yeah, God permitted it. But God knows that many are called and few are chosen, and clearly you're not one of the few. And we see this, I mean, this is not just me being the usual modern, oh, those medievals were so benighted about sex. Anselm is really quite striking. And there's a wonderful letter which you'll be relieved to, in a moment, you'll be relieved that I don't have an image for when I tell you what it's about, which I have taken to calling the necrophilia letter. Yeah, really. This is letter 169 to Gunhilda, daughter of King Harold, early 1094. Gunhilda is a fantastic story. The short version, because you don't need all the details, she was the daughter of King Harold, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. When the Normans invaded, she decamped to a nunnery to be safe. But she never actually took vows, although she did wear the habit. Tempestuous romance with this count named Alan. She was either his mistress or his wife. It's not clear for a few sort of very interesting months before he died. And then she goes back to the nunnery and then gets courted by his brother, who seems also to have been named Alan. It's sort of a George Foreman thing, I guess. And she wants to leave the nunnery again to hook up with sort of Alan number 2. And this is how Anselm writes it. Now, remember, she has never taken monastic vows, but she has worn the habit and she has been inside the walls. And for Anselm, that is enough to impose on her certain obligations, but also open to her a certain pathway into heaven that would otherwise be closed. So here's how he writes. Turn away, sister and daughter, turn away your heart, lest it be so concerned with vanity that it cannot reflect on truth. Consider, what is the glory of the world? What is it that you love? You were the daughter of the king and queen. Where are they? They are worms and dust. Their exalted rank, their pleasures, their riches neither preserved them nor went with them. You loved one who loved you, Count Alan Rufus. Where is he now? Where has that beloved lover of yours gone? Go now, sister. Lie down with him on the bed in which he now lies. Gather his worms to your bosom. Embrace his corpse. Press your lips to his naked teeth, for his lips have already been consumed by putrefaction. Certainly he does not now care for your love, in which he delighted while alive, and you shrink from his rotting flesh, which you longed to possess. This assuredly is what you loved in him, and this and nothing else is what you love in his brother. Think about that. What did you love in Alan number 1, and what do you now love in Alan number 2? Flesh. And what is flesh? It's rotting. It's just putrefaction waiting to happen. Well, in the same, you'd probably quit right now. In the same sort of spirit, we have his very aggressive moves against unchaste priests. Here again, they were so aggressive. He was perfectly within his rights. He was doing what the Pope and the councils had said to do. But he was so over the top about it that even his bishops just pleaded with him. Chill out just a little. You can't. Remember the line from the letter to King Murtoch, even if you can't correct all wrongs at once? Anselm never thought that he couldn't correct all wrongs at once. And so one of my very favorite lines in connection with that, and I had to give the Latin, nihil relaxandum est. No slack is to be cut, no concessions are to be made. Because it's a question of obedience, and obedience is always possible. So we've been exploring two different ways in which Anselm thinks about rectitude of will. On one way of thinking, we have rectitude of will when we fulfill our purpose by loving God for his own sake. On the other, we have rectitude of will when we maintain the place we have been assigned in God's perfectly ordered universe. But the place assigned to rational creatures in the order of the whole just is that of knowing God and loving him for his own sake. So the two approaches to rectitude of will lead us to exactly the same doctrine. But it is a doctrine that raises some philosophical questions. And I want to pursue a couple of them, not in a great level of detail. The first is a question about moral knowledge. This is Rosalind Hursthouse. She is not, in fact, medieval. She is, as far as I know, alive. There's a wonderful expression that she uses. I don't know if it's original with her, the Platonic fantasy. The Platonic fantasy is, as she says, the notion that it is only through the study of philosophy that someone can become virtuous or really virtuous. Now, you might think, given what Anselm has already said, in order to have rightness of will, rectitude of will, you have to be aware of rectitude. What is rectitude? Fulfilling our purposes. What are our purposes? Well, it's determined by this very complicated story about teleology and God. Does this mean we have to have explicit beliefs about teleology in order to have rectitude of will? Well, then it would seem that only theologians would be able to have rectitude of will. And while I think Anselm in principle wouldn't be opposed to that notion, he doesn't in fact think that's the case. Stupid monks, as well as smart, theologically sophisticated monks, can have it. The second question is really about moral motivation. This is Kant, not because this is Kant's view, but it's a sort of cartoon Kant. He also says you have to will rectitude for the sake of rectitude. Does he mean by that in order to be just, we explicitly have to have thoughts along the lines of, this is my duty, and for that reason I will do it?